The sea was black, so black that Thomas Askey thought he could reach out and touch it like glass. But it wasn't just dark, it was alive with cold. That biting kind of cold that crept through his wool balaclava, through his coat, into his bones. He was 19, barely out of school, and here he was, standing on the starboard wing of a slow, groaning freighter named the SS Grodnau, sailing 400 miles south of Iceland at 2 in the morning on October 16, 1941. This was his third run between Halifax and Liverpool. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't have a rifle. He didn't even have a sidearm. He was a merchant seaman, one of 600 men in convoy SC-48, packed tight with merchant ships escorted by a single Canadian Navy destroyer, the HMCS Skeena. He held on to the freezing rail as the ship cut forward at a snail's pace. 8 knots. That sound from below, the rhythmic pounding of the old triple expansion engine, was like a heartbeat, slow and steady, vibrating through the steel deck into his boots. He hated that sound now. It meant they were moving but not fast enough to run. Then came another sound, a metallic ping, far off, faint but unmistakable. He froze. That was the destroyer's sonar. It was hunting. Another ping. Closer. They weren't alone. Thomas squinted into the endless black ahead. His breath fogged up inside his mask. His hands were already numb, but he gripped the rail harder anyway. There were rumors about the wolf packs. German U-boats hunting in groups now. They didn't pick off stragglers anymore. They attacked whole convoys from inside the formation. Suddenly, a flare lit up the night like a miniature sun. Off the port bow, 5 miles out, a rocket. A U-boat had lit them up for targeting. The engine room telegraph rang out, loud and sharp, full ahead. The Grodnau shuddered under the sudden effort, but it was too late. A second flare rose up from the opposite side of the convoy. They were surrounded. Thomas's heart beat like a drum in his chest. Then came the first explosion. It didn't hit them, but it might as well have. The SS Silverbell, a tanker hauling oil, went up in a tower of fire and steam. A blast so powerful it knocked Thomas sideways, his teeth rattling like dice in a cup. Before he could stand, a second blast followed, then a third. The black ocean flashed with violent, unnatural light. The convoy was lit up like a parade, and then he saw it. The SS Iona, just 800 yards ahead. A ship carrying 7,000 tons of frozen bacon and cheese. Thomas saw it struck dead center by a torpedo. There was a low thump, almost like someone hitting a giant drum. Then she broke in half, just like that. The two ends lifted up like a V, then slowly fell. She was gone in less than a minute. It didn't seem possible. All that food, all those men, all that hope, vanished. He couldn't even scream. All he could do was stare as the night turned into a firestorm of death and sinking metal. The Grodnau somehow made it through that night, against every odd, but convoy SC-48 was a slaughter. 9 ships lost, 200 men drowned, nearly 100,000 tons of vital supplies gone. This wasn't just about ships anymore. It wasn't even just about war. This was a war against hunger. Back in London, in a quiet office at the Ministry of Food, Lord Walton read the reports and felt real fear. Not the kind you get in a bomb shelter during an air raid, but the deep, gnawing kind you get when you know something terrible is coming, and there's no way to stop it. Britain was starving, and Walton knew it. Knew that every ship sunk wasn't just steel and men. It was calories. Eggs, bacon, milk. Food that the British public couldn't grow on their own. Food that had to cross oceans. Oceans filled with submarines. You, the reader, imagine you are a housewife in Coventry. It's 1941. The Blitz has broken your windows. You tape them up to keep the glass from shattering. You wake up every morning with your ration book. This is your food for the week. 4 ounces of bacon or ham. That's 4 thin slices if you're lucky. 2 ounces of tea. 8 ounces of sugar. 2 ounces of butter. 1 egg, maybe. If the ship came in, your children are pale. You give them warm water and tell them it's tea. They complain they're cold, but really, they're hungry. You try to grow vegetables in your dig for victory garden, but they come up small and weak. The winter is coming, and the ships are sinking. Lord Walton, Minister of Food, stared out his office window at the grey London morning. He wasn't a general, but he understood war. He'd run a department store before the war. He knew supply chains, numbers, margins, and the numbers in front of him were terrifying. It wasn't just the bombs. It wasn't even just the sunken ships. It was physics. It was space. A single refrigerated ship like the SS Iona could carry 7,000 tons of food. But 7,000 tons of food was barely enough to keep a single city alive for a week. And most of that food? Eggs, bacon, butter, all perishable, all refrigerated, all bulky, all easily destroyed by the press of a U-boat's button. Walton understood what the generals didn't. This war wouldn't just be won with bullets. It would be won with calories. But how do you ship calories across an ocean filled with submarines? The answer came not from the War Office or the Admiralty, but from a lab. A small, quiet, utterly unglamorous building in Ottawa, Canada. That's where men like Dr. Charles J. H. Mackenzie worked. Mackenzie was no soldier. He was a chemical engineer. His team had been working on bombers and boat armor. But now they had a new mission. Take an egg and make it ship. Not just any egg, 10 million eggs. The order came like this. We must ship the food, not the water. Make it light, make it small, make it last. Eggs are 70% water. That means you're basically shipping liquid in a fragile shell across the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world. The cost was absurd. The risk was suicidal. There was powdered egg already. The British had tried it, but it was a failure. You, the scientist, remember the first tin they opened. The smell, metallic, sulfuric, awful. The powder didn't mix. It clumped, congealed, and when it cooked, it smelled like something had died in it. Not food. Not even close. A chemical mistake. Mackenzie turned to Dr. W. H. Cook, a food biologist. His specialty? Bacteria, spoilage, decay. He knew how food died, and together they formed a new kind of task force. Their mission was simple, but nearly impossible. Turn eggs into a weapon of war. The problem was threefold. 1. Oxidation. The fat in the egg yolk went rancid when exposed to air. That's what gave the powder its cardboard taste. 2. The drying process. The British used drum drying, spreading the egg mix on a hot metal drum. It cooked the protein before it even dried. That ruined it. 3. Bacteria. The process wasn't hot enough to kill the microbes, but slow enough to let them grow, which meant the powder could actually make people sick. The solution: a different kind of drying, spray drying. It came from the dairy industry, used for powdered milk. Here's how it worked. You atomized liquid egg into a fine mist, sprayed it into a tall steel tower, then blasted the tower with superheated dry air. The droplets dried in mid-air, so fast the outside cooked, but the inside didn't even heat up. It was fast, clean, perfect. In theory. In reality, it was a nightmare. The first run was a disaster. The egg yolk was too thick for the nozzles. It clogged the system. Instead of a mist, they got sticky yellow goo. It coated the whole tower like caramel. The whole machine had to be taken apart by hand. It took 2 full days to clean. But they didn't quit. Again, Cook said, face tight. They adjusted the pressure, changed the nozzle size, tried thinning the liquid egg. Second attempt. It worked. A light golden cloud settled in the collection bin. The team cheered. They tested it immediately. Mixed it with water. It blended smoothly. Cooked it. It scrambled like a real egg. Looked like scrambled egg. Even smelled like egg. The youngest technician took a bite. He chewed. Paused. "It's better," he said slowly. But it was still wrong. That rancid taste. Faint, but there. The sulfur was gone. But the cardboard was still lurking. The team didn't give up. They tried lower drying temperatures, higher air speeds, different nozzles. Nothing worked. Then came the real breakthrough. And it wasn't mechanical. It was chemical. Dr. Cook noticed something. Odd, a tin left unsealed over the weekend. Tasted far worse than one sealed in glass. That was the clue. Tide feces. Enemy wasn't just in the drying. It was after. When the powder hit oxygen, the fats started to rot. Air was the enemy. And the solution? Genius. They made 3 key changes. Flash pasteurization before drying to kill bacteria. Perfected spray, drying at just the right conditions. Gas packing. The powder was collected in sealed tins filled with carbon dioxide instead of air. No oxygen. No rot. It worked. In late 1942, they sent a coated cable to London. New product ready for field test. A crate of tins crossed the Atlantic on a fast destroyer. A British food officer opened one, mixed it, cooked it. He tasted it once, then again, and sent back a cable with one word: proceed. The word came through the line. Just one word. Proceed. And that was all the scientists in Ottawa needed. The egg had been solved. Now came the real challenge. Turning one lab's miracle into a nationwide operation. Scaling up. Building towers. Feeding a continent across Canada. The government began converting factories, warehouses, and even old breweries into egg processing centers. Spray drying towers, 3 and 4 stories tall, rose up in cities like Winnipeg, Toronto, and Montreal. From coast to coast, Canada became the largest producer of dried egg powder on Earth. What they made didn't look like much. Just yellow dust in plain tins, stamped with numbers and the image of a small maple leaf. But inside those 12-pound tins were the equivalent of 360 whole eggs, with the water and the fragility stripped away. A ship could now carry 10 times the nutritional value it had before. And those ships no longer needed refrigeration. In terms of pure wartime logistics, this was a revolution. Eggs became a weapon. But Dr. Cook and his team didn't stop there. The war didn't need just eggs. It needed bacon. And bacon, unlike eggs, was a nightmare. You're a quartermaster aboard a cargo freighter in 1941. Your hold is packed with massive wooden barrels filled with salt-cured bacon. They're heavy, wet, and worse. By the time you reach Liverpool, up to 1/3 of that bacon is rotten, slimy, green, inedible, thrown into the harbor. It wasn't just waste. It was morale. Soldiers would open barrels expecting food and find spoiled meat. The British called it slab sludge. Again, the enemy wasn't just Germany. It was physics. Bacon is 60% fat, 20% water, and awkwardly shaped. It doesn't pack well. It rots. It leaks. It requires ice or salt and a lot of it. And even then, it doesn't last. But in Canada, the scientists at the NRC didn't just want to preserve bacon. They wanted to transform it. Their idea? Cook it before it was shipped. Remove the water. Remove the fat. Compress it into something better. Something shippable. At plants like Canada Packers, the process began. First, entire slabs of high-grade pork were selected. These were already cured with salt, but now they were fully cooked, rendered until a massive amount of water and fat was gone. Then came the next genius step. The cooked bacon was still warm, soft, flexible. And so they placed it inside massive hydraulic presses, machines that could squeeze the meat under tons of pressure. The result? The strips of bacon fused together into a single dense block. Uniform, flat, solid. No air gaps, no wasted space. Each block was trimmed to fit exactly into a 12-ounce tin. The can was sealed, then heated again, a second round of cooking, this time inside the can. The process was called retorting, and it sterilized the product completely. No bacteria, no spoilage, no refrigeration needed. You could eat it cold, slice it, fry it, or just drop it into a tin of beans and call it dinner. It was shelf-stable for years. Soldiers called it a miracle, and so did the Admiralty. A cargo ship that used to carry 1,000 tons of loose bacon could now carry 4,000 tons of pre-cooked, compressed, sterilized protein. And unlike the old stuff, none of it would rot. The tins were square, stackable, clean, efficient. They could be dropped by parachute, buried for a year, opened in the mud of Italy or the rubble of Normandy, and they'd still be perfectly edible. By 1943, Canadian canned pre-cooked bacon became one of the most requested items from the British War Office. And then came the milk pods. Eggs were solved. Bacon was solved. But milk? Milk was the worst. It's 87% water. It sloshes. It spoils. It needs refrigeration or glass bottles or metal churns, and yet no nation could survive without it. The NRC knew the solution, the same spray drying method that worked for eggs. The towers were ready. The first step was obvious. Remove the fat. Skim milk powder became the Army's best friend. It was almost pure protein. Mixed with water, it became a drink. Added to soup, it became broth. Baked into bread, it made it rise again. But for civilians, especially the children, they needed whole milk. Fat and all. The solution was less perfect, but just as critical. Roller drying. A slower, more durable method. Less soluble, less elegant. But it worked, and most importantly, it lasted. By the end of 1942, the quiet revolution was complete. In Halifax, you're a stevedore loading a cargo freighter. You're not loading eggs in crates. You're loading 12-pound tins of golden powder. You're not loading barrels of wet bacon. You're loading compact protein bricks. You're not hauling milk churns. You're loading white sacks of stable, high-protein powder. This single ship, like so many others, carries not perishables, not fragile crates, not waste. It carries calories, dense, stable, shippable calories. The U-boats are still hunting. Ships are still sinking. But now, with each tin loaded, the math shifts. A convoy can feed more mouths, fill more bellies, last through longer winters. The protein offensive has begun. And the battlefield? It's not just the sea, it's the kitchen. It was a gray morning in Birmingham, January 11th, 1943. You're 7 years old. Your name is Alice. You sit on a wooden bench in a school classroom with taped windows and a chill in the air that never goes away, even with your coat on. Your shoes are too tight. Your socks are too thin. And your stomach, as always, aches with hunger. The air raid sirens had wailed earlier that morning. You and the rest of your class huddled in the shelter under the schoolyard, knees drawn tight, trying not to cry. But now the all clear had sounded, and the school day continued like normal. Whatever normal meant anymore. You shuffle into the canteen, shivering, half hoping for something warm, half expecting the usual. Thin barley soup, watery potatoes, maybe a slice of bread. But today is different. Today is Canada Day. A volunteer from the Women's Voluntary Service stands behind the counter with red cheeks and a big ladle. She smiles. Behind her, 2 large tins are propped up on the wooden table. One has a maple leaf printed on it. The other just says egg, powdered, Canadian, modified. You're handed a steaming metal cup. You sip. It's sweet. It's warm. It's milk. Your hands tingle from the heat of the cup. You hold it tight and sip again. Then comes a square of pale yellow scrambled egg. Hot, dense, sitting on a slice of rough brown bread. The volunteer calls it Canadian egg. You've never had egg like this before. It's not quite the same as the eggs your mum used to make, before the rationing got so bad. But it's warm, and it's soft, and it tastes like something real. You eat it all, slowly, carefully, not a crumb left on the plate. That scene, that small plate and that cup of milk, was being repeated millions of times across Britain. Every school, every factory, every bomb shelter. The Canadian egg was here. It wasn't just food. It was hope in a tin. In the factories of Coventry, workers mixed powdered egg into the dough of victory pies, meals made of mashed vegetables, potato crusts, and anything else they could scrape together. The egg gave it structure. It gave it life. In London, bakers used it to bake cakes again. Real cakes. Not just bread. Not just dry slices. Actual birthday cakes. Wedding cakes. Holiday puddings. The kind of food that said, "We're still human. We're still a nation." The Ministry of Food quietly began redirecting entire portions of supply to the civilian population. This was more than keeping people alive. This was keeping morale alive. And in army canteens, it was gold. You're a British private, 22 years old, stationed in northern Italy. Your boots are wet. Your uniform stinks. The last 2 meals were cold beans and stale bread. Then the mess cook cracks open a new tin. A sizzle. A smell. Bacon. He slices a dense pink block into the pan. The fat hits the heat and bubbles instantly. It pops and hisses. And suddenly, for a brief moment, you're not at war. You're home. He opens another tin. This one is yellow powder. He mixes it with water. It turns smooth like real eggs. He pours it into a second pan. Scrambled eggs and bacon. You haven't seen them together since basic training. You didn't know you'd ever see them again. You eat it slowly, silently, chewing each bite like it's the last real thing you'll ever taste. It's more than food. It's a message, a reminder that Canada, this huge, frozen, faraway land, was behind you. That someone cared. That someone was fighting for you in ways the enemy couldn't bomb or sink. The tins didn't look like much. They were square, dull, military gray, stamped with codes, filled with powder. Soldiers joked about them, called them egg dust or maple mush, but they ate every bite. And in homes across Britain, in the quiet hours when mothers stood in kitchens measuring ounces of butter and scraping out tins, those strange Canadian products became the glue that held families together. Because you couldn't always give your children meat, but you could give them milk and egg pie. You couldn't always afford sugar, but you could make mock custard from powdered milk and sweetened egg. You couldn't stop the air raids, or fix the broken windows, or get your old life back. But you could hand your child a warm cup of milk, and for one small moment, feel like you were still winning something. And that mattered. By early 1943, the tide of war was still uncertain. The Battle of the Atlantic raged on. The U-boats were far from finished. Merchant ships still vanished into the deep. But something had shifted. The British people weren't just surviving. They were holding the line. And behind the scenes, that quiet force, the Canadian food revolution, was now in full swing. Each month, tens of thousands of 12-pound tins of powdered egg left Canadian ports. Every tin was a small miracle of engineering and nutrition. Inside, a shelf-stable, heat-resistant, airtight solution to a problem no bullet could solve. Hunger. Factories ran night and day. Workers in white coats, not soldiers, carried clipboards instead of rifles. In plants from Toronto to Vancouver, spray towers hissed with steam and yellow dust. Forklifts rolled pallets of sealed tins into waiting freight cars. From these factories, food flowed like ammunition. Every ship loaded in Halifax was now a different kind of vessel. No longer refrigerated, no longer fragile, no longer one torpedo away from losing an entire city's week of bread and meat. Now, one cargo hold could feed an army. One freighter carried more calories than 10 ships from 1941. Less weight, less space, no ice, no rot. Every sack, every tin was a strategic weapon. And the military command knew it. You are General Montgomery, standing in a cold tent somewhere in North Africa. Your men are tired, hungry. They've been fighting for days. The supply lines are stretched thin, but a new crate arrives, marked with a small red maple leaf. You crack it open. Inside are dozens of silver tins, Canadian pre-cooked bacon. No fires needed. No salt meat. Just dense protein that can be eaten straight from the can or dropped into stew. It is not luxury, but it is calories. It is morale. The same goes for the airmen. RAF bombers, running 8-hour missions into German territory, needed high-fat, high-protein meals to function. Their rations were upgraded, canned bacon and reconstituted egg sandwiches, fortified bread mixed with Canadian skim milk powder, hot drinks stirred with powdered milk. It was the only thing warm many of them would touch before flying back into the sky. And it all came in with one quiet directive from Allied command. Feed them. Keep them standing, no matter the cost, because something was coming. In the spring of 1943, plans for a new invasion began taking shape. Not another defense, not a counterstrike, but an assault. D-Day. Tens of thousands of soldiers would be needed. Hundreds of thousands. American, British, Canadian. They would gather in the United Kingdom, train for months, then cross the Channel to open a second front in Europe. But this wouldn't be a one-day event. It would be months of fighting, hundreds of miles of ground, and millions of mouths to feed. The Canadian food scientists knew what that meant. Scale. They expanded again. Spray drying towers grew taller. New contracts were signed. Entire milk processing plants were converted. What was once an emergency operation became the largest food logistics engine in the history of Canada. And the funny thing, most of it never made headlines. Back in Britain, civilians joked about the egg. It became part of everyday life. Something you could count on. Something you expected. It showed up in everything. Ration cookbooks, school meals, even church dinners. Add 2 TBSP Canadian egg powder. It didn't sound heroic, but it was. Because while one front of the war was being fought in the mud and the smoke of Europe, another was being won in teacups and breakfast plates, behind every soldier landing in Sicily, behind every factory building, Spitfire engines, behind every child in a cold Birmingham school. There was a can, a tin, a scoop of something yellow that once started in a lab in Ottawa. The enemy had counted on starvation. They had bet on weakness, cold, fatigue, hopelessness. But they hadn't counted on chemistry, on physics, on airless tins and dried milk and compressed slabs of cooked pork. They hadn't counted on the scientists who turned the Canadian kitchen into a weapon. They hadn't counted on food becoming a force of war. It is now early 1944, and the southern coast of England is changing. Fields are filled with tents. Roads are clogged with trucks. Towns once quiet are now bustling with uniforms, accents from across the Empire and the American Midwest, all converging on one mission, the invasion of Europe. The build-up to D-Day has begun. It is an operation so massive that the numbers make generals pale. Over 2 million troops will be staged in Britain, over 5,000. Ships will sail, and every single one of those men, every single vehicle, every single bullet must be fed, not once, every single day. And not just with any food, but with calories that count. High protein, high fat, long shelf life, easy to move, easy to cook, and impossible to waste. That's where the Canadians come in. Back in Ottawa, Dr. W.H. Cook isn't thinking about Normandy. He's thinking about fat oxidation curves, tin seals, and gas packing tolerances. Because the demand coming in from London is now beyond urgent, it's relentless. Canada is now shipping over 1.7 million pounds of pre-cooked bacon every single month. And powdered eggs? By mid-1944, the country is exporting the equivalent of 50 million shell eggs monthly. 50 million, tight, each of them dried, sealed, stacked, and shipped in tins bearing a plain stamp and a small red maple leaf. And still, it's not enough. New factories are brought online in the prairies. Canneries expand in Manitoba. Spray drying towers rumble 24 hours a day. Trains loaded with sacks of powdered milk, tins of bacon, crates of egg dust roll toward Halifax. And every ship that crosses the Atlantic carries one of the most important cargoes of the war. Not guns, not tanks. Calories. You're a British dock worker in Portsmouth. You've been unloading cargo for 3 days straight. You're bone-tired, but you stop when a new crate hits the ground. It's heavy, marked Canadian bacon, pre-cooked. You know what's inside. You crack one open, not to steal but to check for damage. At least, that's what you tell yourself. Inside is a pink brick, dense, solid. It smells faintly like smoke and salt and home. It is, quite simply, food you don't have to worry about, because every other kind of food has been fragile. But not this. This is war bacon. The soldiers coming through see it too. In mess halls across the staging grounds, the menus shift. No more watery cabbage 3 times a day. Instead, scrambled powdered egg on hardtack, fried slices of pressed bacon, boiled bread laced with reconstituted milk. It is not gourmet, but it's warm. It fills the belly, and it keeps men standing. Because the truth was, morale wasn't built in Churchill's speeches. It wasn't always in the rifles, or the letters from home, or the roaring plains overhead. Sometimes it came in the smell of breakfast, in the sizzle of bacon fat in a tin pan at 6 in the morning, before drills, in the golden color of scrambled eggs that weren't gray and sour, but smooth and real, made from Canadian science and cold. Logistics, in a cup of hot milk that reminded a 20-year-old soldier that he was still human. These things mattered. And the high command knew it, because they had done the math. An army can only march so far on willpower. After that, it runs on fat, protein, and sugar. It runs on egg dust and bacon bricks. It runs on milk powder and quiet innovation. So while General Eisenhower sat in bunkers reviewing invasion maps, while ships were painted for D-Day deception, while paratroopers practiced landings on the English coast, a different army, white coats, not khaki, kept the war alive in towers of steam and dust. They didn't carry rifles. They carried formulas, and their battlefield was a lab bench, a mixing vat, a sterile tin can with no oxygen. And when June came, and the landing ships prepared to go, and the tide turned toward France, those tins were already packed, sealed, and stacked inside the hulls. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy are chaos. Explosions, smoke, shouting. The sky is filled with gliders and planes. The sea churns with landing craft. Bodies fall, bullets scream. But behind the smoke and the blood, there's something else. Steel gray crates, each marked Canadian egg powder, modified. Canadian bacon, pre-cooked. Milk powder, skimmed, grade A. The food war has arrived in Europe. and it's just in time. The soldiers hitting the beaches don't think about food. They think about living. They think about not drowning under the weight of their kit. They think about mines and barbed wire and gunfire. But a day later, maybe two, when the adrenaline fades and the mud sets in and the wounded are cleared from the sand, then comes the hunger. Then comes the need. And the tins are there, cans pried open with bayonets, egg powder mixed in steel mess tins, bacon blocks sliced with combat knives, milk powder stirred into hot water over campfires built from broken crates. It doesn't taste like home, but it smells like it, and that's enough. You're a Canadian private stationed just behind the front lines near Caen, France, a week after the landings. The mud is deep, your uniform's stiff, your nerves are shot. But that morning, the mess sergeant yells down the line, "Priority shipments in!" He doesn't need to say more. Everyone knows what it is. The crate opens. The smell hits first. Bacon. Real bacon. He slices the pink block, drops it in a pan. The fat sizzles. Men stop what they're doing. They look up. He opens another tin. Yellow powder. Water. Stir. Into the pan. Scrambled eggs. And for 10 glorious minutes, it's not war. It's breakfast. That smell, hot bacon grease, warm egg, it does more than feed. It reminds you of why you're here, of what's waiting for you after the war, of the country that sent you, of the scientists back in Ottawa who stayed up all night perfecting the drying temperature so your egg wouldn't clump. The smell says, you are not forgotten. You are not just a name on a roster. You are fed, and the war marches on. Through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the shattered cities of France, across the rivers of Belgium, into the heart of Germany itself. Every step forward, another meal hauled through mud, through craters, through machine gun fire, and back in Britain, the food keeps coming. Factories still run. Towers still hiss. The egg never stops. The bacon never runs out. The milk is always there, even as fresh supplies from farms return. Ships sailing freely now. Convoys better protected. U-boat losses mounting. The food scientists don't shut down. They don't stop production, because now they understand. This isn't temporary. This is doctrine. This is how you feed the largest war machine the world has ever seen. And it's not just the front lines. It's children in Leeds, in Liverpool, in Glasgow, who now expect a hot school lunch with egg and milk. It's mothers who can bake again, who can make Sunday dinner without rationing away half the week. It's pilots flying missions over Berlin, with full stomachs. It's factory workers building bombs and tanks who stay on their feet because they had 400 calories of protein that morning, shipped from Winnipeg, pressed in Toronto, sealed in steel, and it's quiet. Nobody writes songs about powdered egg. No statue is built for tinned bacon. But without them, the tanks would stop. The men would collapse. The children would starve, and the war would lose its fire. The food doesn't fight, but it wins. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war is over. The streets of London fill with people. Flags wave. Bells ring. Strangers dance together in the roads. Soldiers kiss nurses. Children laugh. The world exhales after 6 long years of death. But in Ottawa, in a small office inside the National Research Council, no confetti falls. No brass bands play. Dr. W.H. Cook stands by a window, watching spring break through the last of the snow. He doesn't cheer. He doesn't cry. He simply takes off his lab coat, folds it, and lays it on his desk. His war is over, too. But his battlefield was never a trench or a beach. It was a lab bench, a pressure gauge, a spray tower filled with steam and powdered gold. He and his team had no medals on their chest, no headlines, no roaring crowds, but they had numbers. By war's end, Canada had shipped over 200 million shell egg equivalents in tins, over 30 million pounds of pre-cooked canned bacon, millions of pounds of powdered milk, skimmed and whole, enough to feed an entire army every day for years. Their food had crossed oceans, fed pilots over Berlin, fed soldiers in Italy, fed school children in Coventry, and sailors on Arctic convoys. It had filled the bellies of the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy. It had held the line when Britain came close to collapse, and when fresh food returned when rationing slowly lifted, and eggs came back to the pan in their shells, and bacon arrived wet and greasy from the butcher. The world did what it always does. It forgot. The tins disappeared. The egg powder became a joke, a memory of hard times, a thing to mock in post-war comedy sketches. Soldiers groaned about it. Housewives threw away the last tins, unopened. The spray towers were dismantled. Some were turned into plants for making ice cream mix. Others were simply demolished. The massive war-scale production of food vanished almost overnight. The private companies shifted back to peacetime goods. The scientists returned to quieter projects, new materials, plastics, pharmaceuticals. But the war had changed them. They had seen what science could do, not in a lab report, but on the face of a child drinking hot milk in Birmingham, on the smile of a soldier eating bacon in a trench, on the strength of a nation that had no food, yet never fell. Lord Walton, the British Minister of Food, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Canadian food scientists were as vital to our survival as the Spitfire pilots. Without their work, the outcome might have been very different." But no statue was built, no parade was held, because powdered egg is not glamorous. It does not soar or explode or charge, but it saves. And in the end, that was enough. You are a retired Canadian veteran, years later, sitting in your kitchen in Saskatoon. You open a tin of biscuits. Your grandson asks if you ever saw battle. You smile and shake your head. "No," you say. "I fought with tins and towers," he laughs. He doesn't understand, but one day, maybe he will. One day he might learn that a man in a lab coat, half a world away from the fighting, helped win the war. That victory isn't always loud. Sometimes it's dry, powdered, sealed in steel, shipped in crates marked with a maple leaf. And sometimes it comes in the form of a single warm breakfast in a cold and hungry world. The war was won with bombs and bullets, but it was fought on calories and in the quiet corners of history. Behind the flash and the fire, the protein offensive will always stand as one of the greatest, most unsung victories of all.